During the 16th and 17th centuries, in the era when the traditional version of history was created, primarily by authors such as Joseph Scaliger and Dionysius Petavius, historians invented numerous empires that supposedly existed at different times and among various peoples. However, extensive research indicates that throughout the entirety of human history, there was only one world empire, the Russian Horde Empire. This is how it is referred to by the authors of the New Chronology, Anatoly Fomenko and Gleb Nosovsky. Nevertheless, supporters of the traditional historical school object to this notion. If such an empire had truly existed, its fall would have been a global event of its time, which could not have been overlooked in the chronicles. However, neither Russian nor European documents allegedly mention such an event. In reality, this is not the case. The collapse of the Russian Horde Empire is described in great detail in history. It is just known by a different name, the European Reformation. The Reformation is the commonly used term for the religious and social movement that began in the 16th century and spread across Western Europe. The Reformation ideologically prepared the ground for revolutions, fostered a distinct type of human personality, formulated the foundations of new morality, religion, and philosophy. The Reformation left a profound impact on world history and had a global, pan-European character. It is considered that the process of the Reformation has been well studied. Historians have at their disposal numerous documents from that time, such as the Edict of Nantes of 1598, the Index of Prohibited Books by Pope Paul III, the works of the founders of Protestantism Martin Luther, John Calvin, literary works by Erasmus of Rotterdam, and others. However, despite this, many of our contemporaries know very little about it. Starting from the 16th century, the term Reformation began to be primarily used in relation to the religious changes of that time, the conflict between Catholics and Protestants. However, as early as the 15th century, this word was applied to any social and state transformations. For example, we know about the Reformatio Sigismundi or the Reformation of Frederick III in Germany. So, let us try to figure out what the Reformation really was about. Let us recall what modern textbooks and encyclopedias tell us about the events of the Reformation era. The first uprisings flared up in territories that now belong to Germany, Switzerland, and the Netherlands. In the 16th century, these countries consisted of small principalities and free cities. It was precisely there that the Reformation had the greatest success. As a result, in 1581, the Netherlands declared their independence from the Holy Roman Empire. In Germany, the victory of the Reformation led to the strengthening of local princely power and consequently, to even greater political and economic fragmentation. The lands of modern Italy largely fell under the rule of Spain from 1494 to 1559. Portugal achieved independence from Spain in 1640 when Spain was at war with almost everyone. Spain occasionally achieved local victories and annexed new territories, but ultimately lost everywhere. In the 16th and 17th centuries there was a change of many royal dynasties in Europe. For example, in England, the Tudor dynasty was succeeded by the Stuarts. In France, the Valois dynasty was overthrown by the Bourbons. In Russia, after many years of the time of troubles, the ruling Rurik dynasty came to an end, and in 1613, the Romanovs ascended to the Russian throne. Thus, practically for all European countries, the 16th century was a turning point. 3 decades of bloody wars engulfed Europe, with the participation of practically all European countries. This general European military conflict entered history as the 30 Years' War. This confrontation ended with the signing of the Peace of Westphalia in October 1648, which fundamentally changed the Holy Roman Empire. As a result of the Reformation, profound transformations took place everywhere, far beyond the resolution of purely religious issues. Only in the works of later historians was the meaning of the Reformation artificially narrowed. It turns out that instead of fully and meaningfully depicting historical events, historians deliberately distorted the picture of the past. For what purpose? Let us examine in more detail the reasons for the Reformation that official history cites. Historians write that at the beginning of the 16th century, European nations showed a desire for national liberation from Rome and its colossal authority over the Church. They spoke at that time about freeing themselves from the yoke of the excessive power of the Antichrist. However, it is highly doubtful that the Italian Rome and its Church had any real power in Europe at that time, let alone excessive power. Historians themselves claim that the peak of papal authority was reached in the 13th century under Innocent III, but certainly not in the 16th century. Alistair McGrath, a renowned British Christian theologian and theological historian, writes in his book Reformation Thought, an introduction. A development in the later medieval period which is of central importance to a study of the Reformation is the growing crisis in authority within the Church, evident from the 14th century onwards. And indeed, by the beginning of the 16th century, the power and authority of the Pope in many European countries had plummeted to almost zero. Here are a few facts. In Spain, as early as the 15th century, control over the Inquisition court system was transferred from the Pope to the Spanish king. In 1515, the French king Francis I emerged victorious over the combined papal and Swiss forces at the Battle of Marignano. This forced the Pope to grant the French king the right to independently appoint high clergy and thus govern the Church and its finances. Furthermore, the Pope was now compelled to consider the interests of the French king in decision-making regarding Italian affairs. The position of the clergy on the local level weakened the authority of the Roman Church as well. Alistair McGrath writes,
In early 16th century Milan, chaplains had incomes lower than those of unskilled laborers.
Many resorted to horse and cattle trading to make ends meet. In rural France during the same period, the clergy enjoyed roughly the same social status as vagabonds. Their exemption from taxation, prosecution in civil courts, and compulsory military service apart, they were virtually indistinguishable from other itinerant beggars of the period. So, historians themselves acknowledge that by the beginning of the 16th century, the power and authority of the Roman Catholic Church in political, social, and ecclesiastical spheres were very limited. But then, what excessive power of Rome can we talk about? According to the official version of history, the Reformation movement began with the speech of the German monk and theologian Martin Luther. According to a legend that has no reliable historical confirmation, on the eve of All Saints' Day, October 31, 1517, Luther nailed sheets with the text of his famous 95 Theses to the door of All Saints' Church in Wittenberg. In these theses, the first ideologue of the Reformation spoke out against the papal bull of Pope Leo X on absolution and the sale of indulgences. Later, the father of Protestantism translated the Bible from Latin into German and generally became the founder of the German literary language. Luther's followers, Ulrich Zwingli and John Calvin, continued the reforms more radically. Thus, in Zwinglian churches, icons, statues of saints, bell ringing, and organ music were prohibited.
But were rivers of blood really shed during the Reformation because of the violation of Catholic norms? The introduction of a common German literary language, and disputes over whether to allow bell ringing during services?
Alistair McGrath writes, "There was an urgent need to recapture the vitality and freshness of the Christian faith. Many looked back with nostalgia to the simplicity and excitement of the apostolic Christianity of the first century. Could not this golden age of the Christian faith be regained, perhaps by pondering anew the New Testament documents?" This program of reform was the wistful pipe dream of intellectuals throughout half of Europe. Well, intellectuals usually dream and write books, while those who don't read books are the ones who fight. When a peasant uprising broke out in Germany, Martin Luther, the father of Protestantism, did not support it. He was convinced that the people should submit to the authorities. Moreover, he angrily attacked the rebels, suggesting that the princes should kill them like mad dogs.
We have been taught to think that the Reformation was supposedly a purely religious movement aimed against the papacy, against indulgences, against abuses in the Catholic Church, against certain Catholic rituals, in other words, purely religious activity. In reality, this is not the case at all. The Reformers pursued purely political goals. They fought for power, and used religious slogans as a means of attracting people, as a means of creating turmoil. They played on the religious feelings of the people. This is actually what it is all about.
In the modern world, All wars, even those declared as wars for faith, always have a material justification. These holy wars are actually fought for the formation of autonomy or an independent national state. Religion acts as an ideology, as a banner, but in no way as a cause, no matter how much they assure us otherwise. All wars at all times are fought for resources. It is difficult to imagine that in the 16th century the nature of people was fundamentally different. This is well illustrated by the example of the French King Henry of Navarre. He was alternately a Huguenot, then a Catholic, then fled back to the Huguenots. When the path to the French throne opened before him, he, uttering the famous words, "Paris is worth a mass," became a Catholic again. However, historians, in telling their version of the events of the Reformation era, essentially assert that people killed each other for decades over the replacement of the Mass with preaching and making the sign of cross with 3 fingers instead of 2. The lack of real motives in such an explanation, scientists try to compensate for by introducing the concept of social passionarity. The renowned historian Lev Gumilev believed that, for example, the Hussite wars were fought for no reason at all. The Czechs and Germans simply accumulated too much energy, or what he called passionarity, and they began to fight. The most passionate ones killed each other. The level of passionarity naturally decreased, and the wars ceased on their own. Thus, in traditional history, a funny picture emerges.
In some cases, people fight for nothing.
Moreover, the population of an entire country, in this case Czechia, is reduced by several times.
And in other cases, when very serious issues are at stake, everything passes peacefully.
While paying tribute to the magnificent erudition of Lev Nikolaevich Gumilev, one cannot help but acknowledge that his theory of passionarity is simply a classic example of a theory invented to explain itself and nothing more. It sounds something like this: Rome fell because its passionarity decreased. And the fact that passionarity decreased is proven by the fact that Rome fell.
Lev Nikolaevich Gumilev was an interesting historian. He independently discovered repetitions and sine waves in history. Unfortunately, he did not understand that the chronology of history was mistaken. I remember discussing this topic with him several times and trying to explain to him that the repetitions he discovered were artificial. Unfortunately, he did not agree with this, did not delve into the essence of the matter, and preferred to explain these repetitions by some kind of passionarity. When asked what it was, he never really explained it to me or my colleagues. We believe that this is his mistake. Although he did discover this effect, and it is a very interesting effect.
So, historians explain the emergence of the Reformation movement with passionarity, religious fanaticism, and the excessive power of the Pope. They cannot provide any other justification for wars, rebellions, or dynastic changes. But if religious transformation served only as a pretext, and the power of the Pope was ephemeral, then what was the true cause of this pan-European rebellion? Against whom did Europe fight? The new chronology provides an answer to this question.
According to its authors, Europe was a vassal of Russia until the end of the 16th century and regularly paid tribute for several centuries.
Within this version, the bloody events of the Reformation acquire a perfectly understandable meaning. Europe was trying to break free from the rule of the Russian Emperor and create its own independent states. In other words, if we substitute the words Catholic Rome with Russia and the Pope with the Russian Tsar, everything falls into place. So, the Western Europeans were fighting for the national identity and independence of their states, and therefore their national finances, without payments to the Central Russia Horde Authority. That is, the reformers pursued quite secular, political, and economic goals, but covered them with the necessity of religious transformations. During the Reformation era, flyers were actively spreading in some Western European countries. The Roman papacy was depicted in a rather repulsive way on them. There was no religious meaning in these flyers, nor a drop of piety. The defeated enemy, who previously inspired awe and fear, was to be ridiculed fiercely and evilly. Daring Western Europe began to call the power of Russia Horde more and more loudly the Empire of Antichrist, the Kingdom of Pagans, and Babylon. This picture shows the Pope being overthrown to the ground. He holds a document with 8 seals in his hands. It looks very similar to the Russian Novgorod charters with exactly so many seals. One can assume that these were imperial decrees that were sent to the regions because European charters look completely different. Are the rebel reformers trampling on a charter of Novgorod the Great? Most likely, this picture depicts a rebellion not against the dogmas of Catholicism, but against the secular authority of Imperial Russia. And the Pope being overthrown to the ground is a symbol of the Russian Emperor. After all, it was in the 16th century that Moscow became the capital of Russia, which was called the Third Rome. Today it is believed that Moscow took the proud name of the Third Rome as if shyly, without claiming anything special. And Western Europe supposedly tried hard and insincerely to persuade Russia that it really was the Third Rome and had the right to world domination. And please don't refuse. That's what is written in the book, Controversial Issues of Domestic History of the 11th–18th centuries. It cannot be proven that in the Moscow state of the late 15th, early 16th centuries there existed a sense of identity as the heir to the Byzantine Empire in a political sense. However, in the West, attempts were made to instill this idea in the Russian ruler. Thus, documents convey to us a medieval view from Western Europe of Russia as the center of world dominance. For some reason, modern commentators do not like this. Trying to find an explanation for this, they say that the West was trying to flatter Russia. But perhaps such statements were simply an expression of loyal feelings?
Old documents that have come down to us from the 14th–16th centuries show that both in Russia and in Western Europe, the idea that Moscow was the Third Rome was taken seriously and consciously, rather than as some purely ideological or philosophical concept. This is all clear and correct. According to our reconstruction, Moscow in the 16th century was indeed the metropolis of the Russia Horde and was the Third Rome in the truest sense. This is a genuine fact of medieval history.
And the excessive power that the Western Europeans rebelled against at that time was in reality not the power of Italian Rome, but of the Russian Horde. And the cursed word Rome in those days pointed not at Italy, but at Moscow, the capital of the Russian Horde. It becomes understandable why ruling dynasties almost everywhere in Europe changed at that time. Here's how it happened, for example, in Germany. Both the cities and the so-called imperial knighthood were dissatisfied with the princely power. And in the intellectual circles of Germany there were people who dreamed of a complete internal restructuring of the state. The princes were against the emperor. In 1529, at a diet which was held in Speyer, on behalf of Emperor Charles V, it was proposed to restore order. By that time, the emperor had not appeared in his German possessions for about 8 years. The opinions of the participants in the diet were divided. 5 princes and representatives of 14 imperial free cities protested. It was from there that the reform movement became known as Protestants. Historians tell us that the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, Charles V of Habsburg, ruled over a gigantic empire known as the Empire on which the sun never sets, due to its vast size. It included Spanish America, Naples, Sicily, the Spanish Kingdom, Austrian and German territories. Initially, Charles V successfully fought against Protestant princes in Germany, but in 1555, he is believed to be forced to sign a compromise with them. Reading ancient chronicles, one cannot fail to notice a peculiar feature of Charles V. He was always somewhere far away from Western European countries. From the chronicles, it is not even very clear where his capital was located. He was recognized by all as the supreme ruler, but he remained distant, like in the heavens. Sometimes he appeared in Germany, sometimes in France, but usually his governors acted on his behalf. His departure from the historical scene was also unusual. In 1556, he renounced all his titles and retired to a monastery.
Looking at the history of Charles V, one wonders, where was his capital? Sometimes he was in Germany, sometimes in Spain, sometimes he ruled there, sometimes he ruled here. There is no definite place, no definite capital where he constantly resided and from where he ruled his empire. This is impossible. An emperor, a ruler must have a capital. Where is it? According to the proposed version of history, Charles V did not have a specific capital.
According to the authors of the New Chronology theory, Western chroniclers described a Russian emperor or his governor in Western Europe under the name of Charles V.
We have discovered strange, mysterious parallels in medieval and ancient history. It turned out that many ancient dynasties are a reflection of the Russian Horde dynasty of the 13th–17th centuries. In particular, the famous Habsburg dynasty is a reflection of the dynasty of Russian Tsars Khans. In the Habsburg dynasty, there is a famous Emperor Charles V, who turns out to be a reflection of the famous Tsar Khan Ivan IV the Terrible, Ivan Vasilievich. In the documents, by the way, there is an indication of where Charles V ruled, that is, Ivan Vasilievich the Terrible. In Europe, specifically in Austria, or as it was called in those days, Österreich. But this simply means Eastern Empire. Therefore, everything is indeed correct. Charles V, or Ivan the Terrible, ruled in the Eastern Empire, that is, in the Russian Horde.
Here is the official portrait of Emperor Charles V, he is dressed in luxurious imperial clothing, and he holds a scepter and orb in his hands, as in similar portraits of Russian autocratic rulers. Another fact in European history now receives a rather unexpected justification. The end of the 16th and the beginning of the 17th centuries coincides with the birth of the new sumptuous and elaborate Baroque style. Within the framework of traditional history, its emergence is not connected in any way with political changes in Europe. It is said that such a fashion simply arose. However, the Baroque style presupposes the presence of huge resources by the clients. It is interesting to know where such abundance came from immediately after the end of the wars that lasted decades. Everything can be easily explained if we assume that as a result of the Reformation, Europe was freed from the power of the empire and stopped paying imperial taxes. And yet, the empire not only collected taxes but also received income from international trade and the free movements of bank capital. European rulers had a certain excess of money, and they, celebrating victory, hastened to spend it on luxury. However, the euphoria of Baroque lasted a short time and apparently ended immediately after the imperial money was appropriated and spent. So, we have put forward the version that the Reformation is a large-scale and bloody movement that engulfed the whole of Europe for the right not to pay tribute to the great empire with its center in Russia. But in this case, in traditional history, there should remain evidence of the confrontation between Europe and the forces of the empire, that is, Russian troops. And indeed, historical documents report that it was precisely at this time, in the middle of the 16th century, that Russia waged the so-called Livonian War for 25 years from 1558 to 1583. In the school history course, little attention is paid to the Livonian War, and this is at least strange, because it lasted for 25 long years. In these brief historical journeys, historians claim that Russia was waging a war for the Baltic lands. But despite all the efforts made, it achieved nothing, and in the end, peace was concluded on terms unfavorable for Russia.
According to the official historical version, the opposing sides in this military conflict were the Tsardom of Russia and the Livonian Order. According to historians, the order controlled a relatively small territory that included the lands of modern-day Baltic states, part of Poland, and Sweden.
As a result, historians have painted a completely ridiculous picture of a large Russian Tsardom for a long time and with no success fighting a small but proud Livonia. And doing it so unsuccessfully, to the point that they not only gained nothing from the war, but also lost some of their own territory. However, a closer examination of these historical events reveals that in the Livonian War, Russia was fighting against practically half of Europe. Its opponent was not only the Livonian Order, but also Sweden, the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, and the Kingdom of Poland. England and the Netherlands also had indirect participation in the war. It is likely that later falsifiers of history invented this so-called Livonian War in order to hide the true events of the 16th century. The Reformation uprising and the attempts of the Russian Horde to restore order in the empire. They called the war with all of Western Europe a war with Livonia, attributing the achievements of all European reformers to it. It should be noted that at that time, Russians referred to all of Western Europe as either Latvinia, Lithuania, or Livonia. The fact that the so-called Livonian War was a military campaign of the Russian Horde against the rebellious Western Europe is indirectly confirmed by another fact. It was precisely at that time that a terrible wave of madness fell upon European nobility. As Western European historians themselves write, in the 16th century, 178 Reichsgrafs, 88 Reichsabbats, 21 dukes, a landgraf and a markgraf, 50 archbishops and bishops, 7 kurfürsts, and even Emperor Rudolf II went insane in Germany alone. The manifestations of madness are also interesting. For example, Albrecht Friedrich, Duke of Prussia, tore apart portraits of Luther and went to bed in full combat gear, expecting the hordes of Muscovites and Turks to attack Prussia at any moment. In the light of the new chronology, such behavior of the German Duke is completely understandable. The Muscovite hordes, that is, the Russian troops, really stood on the threshold of his possessions. Why was Russian Horde able to create an empire but not able to keep it? In the midst of the rebellion in Europe, the Kazan kingdom wanted to separate from the empire. It is possible that the Kazan Tsar and his court were closely connected with Protestant reformers in Europe. The Russian Horde was forced to suppress the rebels both in the west and in the east. In Europe, only local military actions were carried out to quell the uprisings. The main forces were thrown into suppressing the Kazan rebellion. Probably, at that moment, it was more important for the state. In history, this event is reflected as the taking of Kazan by Ivan IV the Terrible in 1552. Only after that did Russian Horde send punitive troops to Europe. In Russian sources, this event is described as the Livonian War. In turn, the reformist rebels, together with their allies in Moscow, constantly plotted and conspired against the central imperial authority. They actively contributed to the promotion of the pro-Western Romanov dynasty to the top of power in Moscow.
As a result, in the late 16th century, a bloody time of troubles erupted in Russia.
The old Rurik dynasty was destroyed, and the great Russian Horde Empire was divided into many small states. Europe became like a patchwork quilt with the many kingdoms and principalities appearing on it. The religious and political unity of medieval Europe was destroyed. After years of war, Europe was effectively split in half between the Protestant North and the Catholic South. Rebels did not receive support from the southern Roman peoples. The ideas of the Reformation failed to spread to Portugal, Spain, Italy, and the Balkans. These countries resisted reforms for a long time and remained loyal to the empire. Spain resisted the split the longest.
Supporters of maintaining the empire in different European countries provided Spain with all kinds of assistance and support.
But, as we know, history is written by the victors. Therefore, in the pages of history and literature, all the leaders of the Counter-Reformation were portrayed as supporters of absolutism and popular enslavement, and some of them as bloody monsters. For example, Spanish King Philip II.
According to Belgian writer Charles de Coster, the author of The Legend of Till Eulenspiegel, Philip was a degenerate from childhood.
Once, for example, he allegedly burned his monkey alive on a bonfire. Philip II's second wife, Queen of England Mary Tudor, also fought against the Reformation rebellion. During her short reign from 1553 to 1558, she tried to suppress Protestantism and return England to the fold of the Catholic Church. Reformers, who for almost 100 years had shed rivers of blood throughout Western Europe, accused Mary Tudor of having executed as many as 200 Protestants during her reign. For this, Protestant historians dubbed her Bloody Mary. The description of the ruler of the Netherlands, the military commander the Duke of Alba, is no better in the eyes of Protestant authors. In 1567, he suppressed the rebellion of the insurgents in the Netherlands, which was led by William of Orange, one of the rebel imperial governors. For this, the Duke of Alba was dubbed a degenerate, who drowned the progressive liberation movement in blood. So, the assumption that there existed a certain world empire, and European countries fought for their independence against it, logically explains the events of the so-called Reformation. All the wars that were waged in Europe starting from the 16th century have a clear, easily explainable meaning. Blood was shed not for abstract ideas, but for purely material entities such as power and money. It also becomes clear why ruling dynasties changed precisely during this period, and what was meant by the concepts of Rome and the exorbitant power of Rome. There is still one more question, which is not at all simple. If Europe was fighting against the empire, then against whom and what were Martin Luther's famous 95 Theses directed? They clearly speak about the Catholic Church. Vatican views on the Church, faith, and repentance are criticized. And what about the huge amount of other documents of the Reformation era? According to the authors of the New Chronology, the Western Church separated from Orthodoxy only during the Reformation period, after which the term Catholic came to mean only this Christian movement that emerged as a result of the separation.
Catholicism during Luther's time is not the same as modern Catholicism. And regarding the word Catholicism itself, I want to say that it is by no means something hostile or opposed to orthodoxy. Because the full name of the Orthodox Church is the Orthodox Catholic Church. Catholic or Catholic means universal. There is nothing alien in this word. As for Catholicism during Luther's time, it was an imperial religion. Certainly, it differed in some ways from what we had in Moscow. Because at that time, although the religion of the empire was generally unified, in the absence of modern means of communication, such as we have now, complete unity was impossible. And there were local customs, rituals, and much that was their own. although formally it was all part of a single imperial Orthodox Catholic Church.
Catholic and Catholic are actually the same word. The thing is that in the past, this word was written with the letter theta, but today we have lost this letter, and theta was pronounced in two ways, as fe and as te. Therefore, it would be more correct to translate the word Western European Catholic as Catholic, and also to read it that way.
There may be a question as to why Luther and other reformers protested if the Church was unified and orthodox before the Reformation.
Was the Orthodox Church really selling indulgences?
It is known that in Russia, in Orthodox Russia, this did not exist and could not have existed. However, before the final division of the churches, the Roman Church could have been quite independent on many issues and not dependent on the center in Russia. For example, today in the Orthodox Church there are several patriarchates: Moscow, Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, Jerusalem, and others, and none of them are subordinate to each other. So decisions about the issuance of indulgences and many other issues for which Luther criticized the Roman Church could be made by local church leaders themselves. Obviously, it was precisely the disagreement on views about faith and repentance that caused the future schism. However, religion was unified for the time being.
In the 16th century, the religion of the empire was more or less unified. However, there were reformist movements, as in any church. One of these religious reformers was Luther. He tried to create his new faith, and he did something. However, what we have today is already subsequent interpretations of Lutheranism, when Luther's teachings were taken up by reformers pursuing purely political goals. They used Luther's name, they used his popularity, they used his religious slogans. What Luther specifically and precisely said, what he preached, we can hardly know today, because his history was completely rewritten by subsequent reformers for their political purposes.
Martin Luther, as a religious reformer, could have remained a monarchist and a supporter of the empire. It was only after the political and anti-imperial victory of the Reformation that the history of the former Lutheranism, Calvinism, and other movements was tendentiously rewritten. Historians themselves admit that Calvin's ideas were significantly changed by his successors. Thus, we are once again faced with the fact of falsification of historical events and chronicles. It is officially considered that the Reformation in Europe ended in 1648 with the signing of the Treaty of Westphalia. At that time, according to the authors of the new chronology, a long and systematic rewriting of world history began, the main goal of which was to prevent the restoration of the great Russian Horde Empire. At the same time, a wave of mass book burnings swept across Europe. These burnings were of such a grand scale that they became canonical. Usually, we are told that it was the obscurantists and churchmen who destroyed progressive reformist literature. However, let us ask a simple question. Where did such a huge number of reformist books come from in such a short period of time, in an era when book creation was an expensive and very complex process, and in the midst of continuous wars, that they had to be burned on all the squares of Europe? Is it not more logical to assume that the victorious rebels were destroying old imperial books and old history? Despite the efforts of the reformers, starting from the 17th century, many of the territories cut off from the old empire merged again around the former center. The Russian Empire of the Romanovs emerged.
Russia is accused of allegedly constantly trying to expand its sphere of influence throughout the world due to innate malevolence and aggression.
But perhaps the truth is different. This memory of peoples pushes them to unite again and again around the old empire after each time it is destroyed. The destruction of a large number of authentic documents during the Reformation era led to the appearance of many historical mysteries that researchers from different countries are now futilely trying to solve. In the history of Western Europe, one of such secrets is the defeat of the Cathars. In the Middle Ages, powerful Cathar fortresses controlled trade routes and military roads throughout the south of France. Today, many of them lie in ruins. And in Russia, the true history of the uprisings of Stepan Razin in the 17th century and Yemely and Pugachev in the 18th century is still unknown.
All that we know about these events is the invention of historians and writers of the 19th century.
What caused the defeat of the Cathars in Europe? Who were Razin and Pugachev really? And what unites these seemingly unrelated events? Find out in our next film, Soldiers of the Empire. Cathars, Razin,
Pugachev.